It was 1984, and it was morning again in America. The economy was booming, inflation was way down, and the United States was in the midst of a Cold War with Russia. After a rocky few years to start the 1980s, the United States was on solid footing once again, and Americans were feeling very optimistic heading into the 1984 U.S. presidential election. President Ronald Reagan was very popular in the lead-up to the 1984 presidential election. In fact, he had an approval rating in the high 50s and was expected to easily win his re-election bid. The Democrats essentially had zero chance of victory in 1984, and many prominent Democrats declined to run for the nomination. They had a good reason. They knew that they were going to be crushed by President Reagan. In the end, Senator Walter Mondale ended up winning the nomination, narrowly beating out Gary Hart. Walter Mondale was going to be the sacrificial lamb who would go up against the buzzsaw that was President Ronald Reagan. President Reagan wasn't going to need to do much to win the race. In fact, when Walter Mondale secured the nomination for the Democrats, President Reagan was already polling 12 to 14 points ahead in the polls. President Reagan continued to pull ahead in the polls. On election night in 1984, President Reagan would secure one of the most lopsided wins in the history of the presidential election, as he defeated Mondale by over 18 points. In fact, the Reagan-Bush ticket would end up with 525 electoral votes compared to just 13 for Walter Mondale. Ronald Reagan, a former Hollywood actor, had a great sense of comedic timing and came across as being very likable. Mondale, on the other hand, was seen as being quite stiff. There were three iconic moments during the 1984 presidential election that really secured President Reagan's victory. Number 1. The slingshot. At a campaign rally in Fairfield, Connecticut on October 26, 1984, a relaxed President Reagan attacked Mondale's defense policies and previous Senate votes. During the speech, an audience member adds her 2 cents about Mondale, and Reagan humorously plays off of her outburst. Let's watch.
Now, you know that Nathan Hale was from Connecticut. Now, I'm not going to claim he was a Republican. That would be almost as bad as my opponent invoking the name of Harry Truman to defend his defense policies. I hope you've all noticed that my opponent, who back in the primaries sounded like he thought the world was Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, has suddenly discovered that America has some dangerous adversaries out there. The man who all his years in the Senate voted against every weapon system except slingshots is now talking tough about our adversaries and the need for national security. You're right, he doesn't. To those of you who are too far away to hear, a lady up here said he doesn't know what he's talking about. She's absolutely right.
Number 2. Every time they're knee-jerks, we get kicked. In an address to the nation on the night before the presidential election, President Reagan made his case as to why he should be re-elected. In the speech, President Reagan specifically targeted the Democrats' economic and tax policies. This speech included the famous line, "Every time they're knee-jerks, we get kicked."
But our opponents have a very different vision for your future. Where we look at a problem and see opportunity, they look at opportunity and see a problem. We believe in knowing when opportunity knocks. They seem determined to knock opportunity. We work to increase your take-home pay. They're working overtime to tax it away. Despite their good intentions, I don't believe they place enough faith in people. Rather than encourage you to dream great dreams and provide opportunities to help America grow, they keep trying to make government grow. They do everything they can to save us from prosperity. And they keep right on giving us the same medicine that made us sick in the first place. They fought the idea of giving you a tax cut. If they'd had their way, average families would be paying over $900 more in taxes today. They've tried to repeal indexing, which protects working people from higher tax brackets. Indexing doesn't help the rich. They're already in the high brackets. Well, we stopped them, but they kept predicting disaster. They said our tax reduction would be, quote, murderously inflationary. That was just before inflation was reduced from 12.4 to around 4%. They said there would be no recovery just before recovery took off. Then they said it couldn't last. And now we have the best economic expansion in 30 years. Their team has a plan that will raise taxes the equivalent of more than $150 per household every single month. They have a knee-jerk addiction to tax increases. And every time they're knee-jerks, we get kicked.
Number 3, the ageist reversal. Finally, the second presidential debate between President Reagan and Walter Mondale included one of the most iconic lines in the history of the presidential debates. People panned Reagan's performance in the first debate, saying that he was boring and meandering. President Reagan seized the opportunity in the second debate, completely reversing the line of attack on him that he was too old to continue serving as president.
I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.